You probably think you know the Vikings. Big, brawny warriors in horned helmets, charging into battle with wild eyes and blood-stained axes. You picture a world of endless raiding, heavy feasting, and heroic deaths in the middle of clashing steel. But if you'd actually lived among them, you might have found yourself in far more danger from words than weapons. Because Viking society, beneath the smoke, the sagas, and the songs, wasn't just brutal in war. It was brutal in rules. Rules so personal, so suffocating, they reached into your bedroom, into your voice, into the way you stood in a crowd. One torn shirt could shatter your life. One whispered insult could turn you from a respected warrior into a social corpse in minutes. Tomorrow morning, in that world, you might wake up, dress for work, and discover your wife had the legal right to divorce you on the spot because your collarbone was showing. She'd take your property, your reputation, your future, and she wouldn't have to fight you for it. The law would be on her side. That's because the Vikings had built something extraordinary and terrifying. A society wired with sexual paranoia so intense that modern courtrooms look like playgrounds in comparison. It governed everything. How you fought, how you walked, how you mourned your father. It could make you kill your best friend over a joke, or force you to murder your own son to prove your masculinity. This isn't the heroic Viking saga you heard in school. This is the raw, unfiltered truth, drawn straight from law codes, sagas, and eyewitness accounts of a civilization built on sexual terror. The great hall was crowded. The fire burned low, shadows stretching across faces that watched in silence. One man stood accused. His skin drained pale the moment he heard the word fall from his enemy's lips. Raga. A single syllable. That was all it took to sign his death warrant. Every warrior in the room knew what came next. He had three choices: kill his accuser immediately, accept total social death, or face outlawry, becoming a man with no rights, hunted by anyone who pleased. There was no fourth option. The word raga didn't just mean unmanly. It meant passive in bed, a man who allowed himself to be penetrated. In the Viking mind, that wasn't just shameful. It was annihilating. And it didn't matter whether it was true. The suspicion alone was enough to destroy you. At the top of Viking society stood the real men, those who penetrated. At the bottom were the suspected ergi, the penetrated, and you didn't even have to be caught in the act to be thrown to the bottom. Stand too close to another man? Risky. Let your voice crack during a war cry? Dangerous. Cry too much at your father's funeral? You might as well start digging your own grave. The paranoia was relentless. Men watched each other constantly, hunting for the smallest slip. It wasn't just about defending honor. It was survival. And the real genius of this system? It made men police themselves. Better to kill your best friend than let him start a rumor. Better to cut down your cousin than let a joke take root. The sagas are full of these stories. A man murders his shield brother because he joked about them swimming naked together. Another kills his cousin for mentioning that, once, he'd worn a torn shirt that showed part of his chest. The Viking law codes even listed which words required blood. Raga, Sorden, Strodin, not insults. Death sentences. Say the wrong one, and the man you accused could kill you immediately with no trial. Hesitate to kill him? You'd just confirmed the insult. And your life was over. And the laws got creative. Combine your insult with something else, and it hit twice as hard. Call someone beardless raga, and you'd insulted both their masculinity and their age, meaning double compensation or double the blood. The medieval Icelandic law code devoted 16 pages to sexual insults alone. 16 pages of words that meant kill or be killed. Women had their own rules. A woman calling another woman unmanly meant nothing. But accuse her of being too sexually eager, of enjoying it too much, and you triggered the same violent chain reaction. The fear seeped into everything. Clothing, gestures, even the way you walked. Warriors practiced deepening their voices, grew beards specifically to block beardless insults. Some even scarred their own faces to look more dangerous. And the most terrifying part? Truth didn't matter. Once the accusation was public, only blood could wash it away. It was a society where kindness could kill you, where mercy was suicide, and all of it was justified by the gods. Gods who, paradoxically, ignored these rules entirely. Thor's mighty hammer wasn't just a weapon. In weddings, it was a sexual object. On the marriage bed, the bride would sit while the groom pressed the real Mjolnir, heavy enough to break bones, between her thighs. Witnesses would chant blessings. The ritual wasn't symbolic. It was divine penetration. Compared to the other gods, Thor was tame. Loki could shift his shape and his gender at will. One famous story, told to Viking children as casually as a bedtime tale, had him turn into a mare, get mounted by a stallion, and give birth to an 8-legged horse. Odin himself practiced a type of magic that required him to take a passive role, by his own people's laws, that made him a Raga. Yet no mortal dared use those rules against the gods. The hammer ritual was just the start. After the blessing, the entire wedding party would follow the couple into the bedchamber. Not to leave them in privacy, to participate. Some sang explicit songs about what the couple should do. Some banged drums to set the rhythm. In certain regions, the bride's mother physically guided the groom while Thor's hammer lay on the bed, sanctifying the act. The next morning, the sheets, stained with blood, were publicly examined. Too little blood meant the bride wasn't a virgin. Too much meant violence. Either way, the sheet was preserved as legal evidence, ready to be pulled out in court years later. It was all part of the same machine, sex as public trial, intimacy as performance. And this machine didn't just live in the bedroom. It spread through the longhouses, the fields, the festivals, and it would twist Viking life into something far more suffocating than most modern audiences can imagine. A room 60 feet long and 20 feet wide. The walls are timber and turf, the ceiling low, the air thick with wood smoke that stings your eyes and burns your throat. You share this space with your grandparents, your parents, your siblings, your cousins, your children, the family slaves, and the livestock, cows, goats, horses, all breathing the same stale air, all just a few steps from your bed.
This was the Viking
longhouse. And if you were married, this was where you were expected to have sex. If you were lucky, you might have a curtain of woven wool to separate you from the rest of the household. Most had nothing at all. Your wedding night took place with your in-laws lying within arm's reach, listening to every sound. Your children would fall asleep to the rhythm of your breathing, or stay awake, hearing things they'd remember for life. The old Norse language didn't even have a word for privacy. It simply wasn't a concept they recognized. The Vikings weren't ashamed of sex itself. They were terrified of doing it wrong. Every sound you made could be judged. Too loud, and you were showing off. Too quiet, and you were hiding something shameful. The wrong sound at the wrong moment could start a rumor that ended in a blood feud. And in the longhouse, everyone heard everything. The central fire pit gave warmth and light, but it also filled the room with smoke until your eyes streamed and the air turned to fog. You couldn't see across the hall, but you could hear every rustle of straw, every gasp, every shift of blankets. In winter, for 6 months at a time, nobody left except for urgent needs. 30 people trapped in that same dark, smoky room, cooking, sleeping, arguing, coughing, and pretending not to hear the couple in the corner. There were unspoken rules. Never acknowledge the sounds you heard in the night. Never make eye contact the next morning. Never speak of anything unusual, no matter how strange. One saga tells of a man who listened to his own brother being murdered in the dark, and said nothing, not because he didn't care, but because breaking the code of silence was more dangerous than bloodshed. But for couples, silence brought its own dangers. Viking culture tied a man's honor directly to his sexual performance, and it had to be loud enough for others to hear. A husband who couldn't satisfy his wife in a way that was obvious to the household risked humiliation and social death. A wife who didn't respond loudly enough could be branded defective. Every night was a performance. Every morning was a review. Children learned the rules early. By age 5, they'd already witnessed dozens of encounters. By age 10, they could interpret every sound. Which ones meant masculine success, which ones meant failure. It was a language of survival. The slaves had it worst. They slept nearest the animals, on bare earth, without even a curtain. Their bodies were used at will by their owners, sometimes in full view of the rest of the household. It was normal for the morning milking to include watching the master take a slave girl against the stall wall, while others carried on with chores as if nothing was happening. Some couples tried to escape the crowd by sneaking outside on summer nights, heading for the barns or the fields. But this too carried risk. If you hid, people assumed you had something to be ashamed of, and in a society where suspicion alone could ruin you, secrecy was dangerous, so people developed silent signals. A certain way of folding a blanket meant, "I'm available tonight." A pair of coughs meant, "Not now." A hand brushed across a certain part of the bed meant, "Wait until they're asleep." Whole relationships were conducted through glances, gestures, and coded touches, all under the constant presence of witnesses. And those witnesses had legal power. That aunt who pretended to be asleep on your wedding night could testify about your performance in divorce court. Those children who'd grown up hearing you could, years later, use their memories as evidence against you. One bad review, and your marriage, property, and reputation could vanish. The pressure was relentless. There was no such thing as a truly private moment. Not in love, not in marriage, not even in bed. And for those unlucky enough to be captured in Viking raids, the Longhouse wasn't the end of their suffering. It was only the beginning. The morning fog over Dublin lifted slowly, revealing the marketplace. Wooden platforms stood in neat rows, and on each one human beings waited, naked, shivering, and silent. Some stared at the ground. Others kept their eyes fixed ahead, faces blank, as if bracing for the next blow. The auctioneer grabbed a young woman's jaw and forced her mouth open, showing her teeth like she was a horse. Buyers stepped forward, running their hands over her arms, her hips, her hair, inspecting her like a piece of livestock. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't illegal. This was the economic engine of Viking Dublin, a city where almost 1/3 of the population lived in chains. Prices were well known. A healthy male labourer, 12 ounces of silver. A young woman fit for household duties, 15. Children under 10 could be bought for 8, provided they had no defects. And everyone knew what household duties really meant. The Vikings kept detailed records. Height, weight, scars, teeth, even suspected virginity, all carefully noted. And the cruelty was in the details. Slaves weren't people under Viking law. They were property. Killing one carried the same penalty as killing a cow. Raping one wasn't even considered a crime unless it lowered their market value. The Dublin market specialized in Irish captives, but the trade stretched across the known world. Slavic peoples were so heavily taken that their name, Slav, became the root of the word slave. English monasteries yielded educated captives who fetched high prices. Scottish Highlanders were valued for their ability to endure cold. Each ethnicity had its own stereotype in the Viking marketplace. The inspection was designed to humiliate. Buyers made slaves run in place to check stamina. They yanked lips back to count teeth. Women were prodded in ways that left no doubt about their intended use. The auctioneer encouraged it. There were no returns. Better to check everything now. Once purchased, the nightmare only deepened. Owners had absolute sexual rights over their slaves, not just permission, but expectation. A man who didn't use his female slaves was considered suspicious, even unmanly. Children born to slaves entered a cruel lottery. If the father acknowledged them, they might be freed, or they might not. It was entirely the master's choice. Some men boasted of having dozens of slave-born children, keeping some, selling others, and never asking the mother what she wanted. The emotional torture was as vicious as the physical. Slaves served their captors at feasts, pouring ale for the same men who had burned their villages. They slept under the same roof as those who had killed their parents. Some women were loaned out to guests as a form of hospitality. Refusal meant beating or death. Pregnancy might lead to forced abortion through violence, or the birth of another child destined for sale. And for some, even death offered no escape. Slaves could be killed and buried with their owners, not as a mark of honor, but as grave goods to serve them in the afterlife. Sometimes this meant being buried alive. The Dublin market was efficient. It had transportation networks stretching from Iceland to Constantinople. It offered bulk discounts. It pioneered human trafficking methods that would be used for centuries. And it was all regulated, taxed, and protected by law. For the captives, the only choices were survival or the grave. And sometimes, survival meant agreeing to a fate even worse than death. One such fate would stun an outsider, and yet, to the Vikings, it was a sacred duty. A duty that began with a funeral, and ended with a ritual that would make even hardened warriors avert their eyes. The Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlon had travelled thousands of miles from the Abbasid Caliphate into the frozen north. He'd seen strange customs before, but nothing prepared him for what he was about to witness. The funeral of a Viking chieftain. The dead man's longship sat on the shore, its hull packed with offerings, weapons, food, drink, even dogs and horses to serve him in the afterlife. But there was one more companion the chieftain would need. The slaves were gathered and asked a single question. Who will join your master in death? There was no hesitation from the young girl who stepped forward. She knew exactly what she was volunteering for. In the brutal logic of Viking slavery, this was her best option. She would be honored, well-fed, and given fine clothes for her final days, a sharp contrast to the years of abuse behind her. But she was also marked for death. For 10 days, they dressed her in silks and gold. They gave her strong drink from morning until night. She sang, she laughed. She pretended these were her wedding preparations, and in a way they were. On the final day, she was led to a raised platform overlooking the funeral ship. Below her, hundreds of Vikings watched in solemn silence. 6 men stepped forward, the chieftain's closest companions. And here, Ibn Fadlon realized the truth. This was not merely a farewell. It was a ritual. Each man was required to have sex with her in full view of the crowd. Not privately, not hidden. This was a performance, and the audience was the community itself. As each man took his turn, he whispered the same words into her ear. Tell your master I did this out of love for him. They weren't there for their own pleasure. They were there to send a message, using her body as the letter. Overseeing it all was the Angel of Death, an older woman who specialized in ritual killings. She held the girl's head, whispered comforts about the paradise waiting for her, and directed the men on how to perform properly. Ibn Fadlon watched as the girl's drunken confidence faded. By the third man, she was sobbing. By the sixth, she had gone silent, staring into nothing while the Angel of Death stroked her hair and hummed funeral songs. When it was over, the ritual still wasn't finished. The Angel of Death lifted her 3 times and asked her what she saw. The girl replied, first her parents, then her ancestors, and finally, her master in paradise. The crowd murmured approval. She was saying exactly what they wanted to hear. They led her into the tent where the chieftain's body lay. The men who had just used her now held her down. A rope went around her neck. The Angel of Death produced a dagger. The killing had to be slow, too quick, and her soul would not be prepared for the journey. So the angel stabbed between the ribs again and again, avoiding fatal spots, while the rope tightened little by little. Outside, the crowd beat drums and sang louder to drown her screams, not from shame, but from religious ecstasy. The greater the suffering, the more powerful the magic. When she finally went still, they placed her beside the chieftain in the ship, arranging her hands in the posture of a servant. Torches were thrown. Flames rose. The people cheered as the 2 bodies burned together. Ibn Fadlon turned away and vomited. When the Vikings saw his horror, they were puzzled. To them, this was beauty, a willing sacrifice, a sacred ritual. They could not understand why he saw only cruelty. And this blending of sex, violence, and humiliation was not confined to funerals. On the battlefield, the Vikings had found ways to destroy a man without killing him, leaving him alive to carry his shame forever. The battlefield outside Uppsala was littered with bodies. The air smelled of blood and smoke, and the cries of the dying carried on the wind. Thorold moved through the wreckage, searching for one man, his rival, Bjorn. He found him lying in the mud, wounded but alive. Thorold could have given him a warrior's death, a quick blade to the heart, an end fit for the sagas. Instead, he knelt and drew his knife. But he didn't aim for the chest or the throat. With careful precision, Thorold carved a shape into Bjorn's forehead, the unmistakable outline of female genitals. It was called the clam hug. The wound wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to brand, to turn a man into a living symbol of penetration, a walking declaration that he had been used like a woman. And here's the most chilling part. It was completely legal. There was no law against this kind of mutilation. In fact, warriors who delivered a particularly creative clam hug were admired for their skill. The sagas describe men discussing their artwork, the way modern fans discuss a brilliant sports play. The effect was instant and devastating. A man marked this way was socially dead. He couldn't enter the great hall. He couldn't fight alongside other warriors. His wife could divorce him without question. His children could disown him. His property could be taken. All because of a scar. Some tried to hide the mark, growing their hair long, avoiding public gatherings, but hiding only confirmed the shame. Real men were supposed to display their battle scars proudly. A hidden scar meant you were hiding the truth, and the practice evolved. Some warriors became known for their signature style, carving in elaborate detail. Others preferred abstract patterns that still suggested penetration without being explicit. It became a grim form of competition. Who could leave the most humiliating mark? The cruelty was surgical. Men marked this way weren't killed in battle, because death in combat was the only ticket to Valhalla. Instead, they were left alive, condemned to a life without honor and an afterlife without glory. Women weren't spared either. While the clam hug targeted men, women could be marked with symbols declaring them public property. A woman with such a mark could be used by any man without legal consequence. The Vikings even considered this merciful compared to killing, as if leaving someone alive to endure years of degradation was an act of kindness. These marks turned people into ghosts, cut off from the living without the release of death. Some became bandits in the forests, others simply disappeared. But humiliation wasn't confined to the battlefield. In Viking society, even words, poetry, could start blood feuds that lasted for generations. Bjorn Ongir was the most dangerous man in Iceland, and not because of his sword. He didn't kill with steel. He killed with verses. It started when he wrote love poetry about Thordis Grimsdottir. Not obscene lines, not even particularly suggestive, just romantic stanzas praising her beauty. But in Viking society, that was enough to start a war. Her brothers were furious. They hunted down and killed anyone who repeated Bjorn's poems. And Bjorn, he kept writing new ones. With every stanza, the body count grew. The law made this madness logical. The Grogus Law Code explicitly banned composing love poetry about women. The punishment was full outlawry, which meant anyone could kill you without legal consequence. It didn't matter if the woman enjoyed the attention. Consent was irrelevant. In Viking belief, a love poem didn't just describe desire, it created it. The right words could magically compel a woman to want the poet, whether she wished it or not. It was considered a kind of supernatural assault. They even believed poetry could physically affect the body. A verse about a woman's breasts might make them ache for the poet's touch. Lines about her thighs could supposedly make her legs open involuntarily. A skilled poet was seen as a walking weapon. But honor was the real fuel for the bloodshed. A woman who appeared in a love poem was instantly sexualized in the eyes of the community. Every man who heard the verse imagined her in bed. Her father and brothers would be shamed. The only way to restore the family's honor? Kill the poet. Some feuds lasted generations, with each side hiring poets to strike back through verse. It became a blood-soaked game of escalation. One poem inspired another, which inspired another killing. The sagas record dozens of cases where families were wiped out over nothing more than words. Even the Christian conversion didn't kill the practice. It just made it more complicated. Monks introduced new poetic forms, and Vikings adapted them. Poets began hiding sexual meanings inside religious verses. Suddenly, a line about salvation could mean orgasm. A resurrection could mean an erection. Secret poetry societies emerged. Members memorized each other's work so the verses could survive if the poet was killed. In some cases, poems were passed down like family heirlooms, even if reciting them meant risking your life. The Vikings loved their poetry too much to give it up. They loved it even when it destroyed them. And poetry wasn't the only arena where sex and law collided. Marriage itself was a public performance, one with witnesses, legal inspections, and consequences that could ruin entire families. The newlyweds could hear them breathing outside the door. 6 witnesses, family members, neighbors, even in-laws, pressed against the thin wooden wall, straining to hear every sound. Astrid was 15. Her new husband was sweating through his wedding tunic, trying to ignore the fact that her father was among those listening. They weren't perverts. They were legal observers. In Viking law, a marriage wasn't valid until it was consummated, and consummation had to be witnessed. This didn't mean simply knowing it happened. The witnesses had to hear it, in detail. They judged the timing, the rhythm, the sounds of satisfaction. Too quiet meant failure. Too quick meant inadequacy. Their testimony could dissolve the marriage before the first sunrise. And it didn't stop with the ears. The next morning, those same witnesses would enter the room to inspect the sheets. Bloodstains meant the bride had been a virgin. No blood meant she wasn't, or the groom had failed to perform. The sheets became legal evidence, sometimes preserved for decades in case of disputes. If a wife later claimed her husband wasn't performing his duties, she could demand a repeat performance, with witnesses present. The husband would have to comply or face divorce for inadequacy. The observers would report on erectile function, duration, and enthusiasm, and their words carried the force of law. The psychological pressure was crushing. Men drank potions and prayed to Freya for potency. Women learned to fake the sounds witnesses expected. Sex became theater, where a bad review could destroy your life. Families even developed elaborate tricks to game the system. Some staged fake performances for witnesses while sleeping separately in private. The wealthy sometimes built special acoustic rooms to amplify sounds for the audience. And then there was corrective witnessing, when families demanded a troubled couple prove their marriage with a live performance, often in front of hostile relatives. It went beyond marriage. Business alliances and political treaties could require witnessed consummations between the families involved. In the Viking mind, a man's ability to perform sexually was proof of his worthiness to make deals. For women, the witness system was its own trap. A bride who bled too little faced suspicion. Too much bleeding suggested weakness. Every reaction was analyzed and stored in memory, ready to be brought up years later in court. The Church tried to abolish these pagan practices, replacing them with private confessions to priests. But for centuries, many Vikings clung to the old ways. For them, sex wasn't private. It was law. And these laws weren't confined to bedrooms. They spilled into the open during public festivals, celebrations that combined feasting, gambling, and torture. Little Eric thought the autumn blot would be fun. His parents promised music, games, and honey cakes. He imagined dancing and feasts. What he saw instead would never leave him. In the center of the festival grounds, carpenters were building a platform. Eric thought it was for a play, until they dragged a captured Saxon onto it. The crowd gathered. Children perched on their father's shoulders for a better view. Merchants called out their prices. The smell of roasting meat hung in the air, and in the middle of it all, the executioner prepared for the blood eagle. Viking festivals mixed family entertainment with ritualized torture. Puppet shows for children played just steps away from public executions. The blood eagle, where a victim's ribs were broken outward to resemble wings, was the main attraction. And it wasn't just killing. It was performance art. Before the sacrifice, captured women might be auctioned for temporary use during the festival. Winners got public access while the crowd cheered. If the women survived, they were later sacrificed as part of the offering. Communities saw this not as cruelty, but as religious duty. The gambling was as sophisticated as the violence. Bets were placed on how many ribs could be broken before the victim passed out, or how long they would last from the first cut to death. Children learned math from calculating the odds of a man's suffering. Local variations added to the horror. Uppsala specialized in hangings combined with mutilation. Trondheim preferred drowning rituals. In Iceland, they froze captives in elaborate winter spectacles. Some victims were kept alive between festivals, fed and nursed back to health, only to be tortured again the following year. Body parts became souvenirs. Finger bones were worn as charms. Hair was braided into fertility talismans. Specific organs were claimed by warriors for luck in battle. The logic was consistent and terrifying. The gods demanded pain for prosperity. If the harvest failed, the community concluded they hadn't tortured enough. For women trapped in abusive marriages, escaping this world meant navigating another kind of cruelty: Viking divorce law. In theory, a woman could leave her husband for violence, inadequate sex, or cross-dressing. In practice, it was a legal obstacle course designed to make escape nearly impossible. The process required 3 formal declarations, each in a specific place, in front of specific witnesses, within strict time limits. The first had to be at the couple's bed, the exact spot where the marriage had been consummated. The second had to be at the main doorframe during a meal, with at least 5 adults present. The third at the thing, the public assembly. If she missed one step, or the timing was off, she had to start over. Thorstein Egilsson's wife, Gudrun, knew the process well. Her husband had broken her jaw the previous winter. Now she was determined to be free. Thorstein tried every trick to stop her, sleeping with weapons so she couldn't get near the bed, refusing to eat at home so she couldn't make the doorframe declaration, and spreading honey on the threshold so she might slip and misspeak. Gudrun prepared for every obstacle. She had powerful brothers as witnesses, a wealthy father to bribe officials, and a perfect memory for legal loopholes. She made each declaration without error, dodging Thorstein's men as they tried to shout her down. By the time she reached the assembly, he accused her of theft to delay the process, but she had receipts for every possession she owned. In front of the gathered crowd, she spoke the final words. The marriage was over. Most women weren't so lucky. They lacked the resources or allies to endure the process. For them, the law was a trap disguised as protection. But sometimes, the system could be turned against itself. In one long house thick with smoke, Holgerd looked at her husband, Thorvald, and spoke the words that would destroy him. He dresses like a woman, showing his chest like a wet nurse. By Viking law, this was a public accusation of unmanliness, social death. Witnesses were named. Evidence was given. Within hours, Thorvald had lost his property, his contracts, his family's honor. Friends crossed the street to avoid him. Even beggars refused his coins. Holgerd had beaten her husband for years, not with fists, but with the law. She had turned the same weapon that oppressed women into a blade sharp enough to cut down a man in a single day. This was Viking society, a world that celebrated shape-shifting gods but executed men for soft voices, that demanded witnesses for marital sex but banned love poetry, that turned slave rape into religious ritual but ended marriages over a torn shirt. It was a culture where law, religion, and daily life were woven together with threads of fear, humiliation, and control. And perhaps the most chilling part, to the people who lived in it, none of this was strange. It was simply tradition.